Thank you so much for coming out for this event. It's really nice to see you here. This space is a wonderful space, really important to this city, to this community. They're not charging anything to get in. On your way out, there is a red bucket. What is that called back there? Donation bucket. It's the coffee thing. Okay, Folgers Coffee. So on your way out, it would be really great if you'd put in a couple dollars or more or whatever you can, just to support this space. We're here to launch this new book, Against Capital in the 21st Century. And this week, I was asked a few times, why would you launch a book in a punk space? Why would you launch a book in a venue like Black Sheep? And this is actually the second time I've launched a book here. And it makes all the sense in the world to me. And it's really about subversive creativities, right? So what you just heard, what you just saw, is different, and it's against the grain, and that's what I do too, in a different way, but it's what I do as well. It's different. It's against the grain, and I like things that go against the grain. I like ideas and music and art that confront the world as it is and challenge it, and I think that's what you hear in the music, and that's part of what I'm going to talk about this evening. So subversive creativities it's important to have spaces where people can do creative things that are different, things that are out in the margins, and in a community where people feel themselves in the margins, it's absolutely essential to have a space like this where people can go and they can feel that there are spaces of the margins or marginalities, gatherings of marginalities. And gatherings of marginalities is where all the good stuff comes, also in history. So that's why I like to launch books in punk rock spaces. We're sitting here this evening in between May Day, the International Workers' Holiday. That was on Tuesday, the great anarchist and revolutionary day of revolt, of critique of abolitionism. And pinioned in between May Day and Marx's 200th birthday, which is tomorrow. It is the eve of Marx's 200th birthday. And in a way, it's unfortunate to say that the ideas of May Day, the ideas of Marx, are more important now than ever. It would probably have been much better to say that all of it was obsolete. But the fact is that we don't live in a world where that's the case. This new book, Against Capital in the 21st Century, attempts to help us to overcome obstacles in imagining a world ungoverned by capital, a world of different possibilities that are both desirable and practical. And this book is an edited volume. It's an edited volume that's comprised of rival visions that can be read as an alternative to the whole litany of administered economies, tax policy, recommendations, half measures, the history of government failures to reverse the most dangerous capitalist tendencies is as old as capitalism itself. And what my co-editor and I, John Gilman-Opalsky, and I have tried to do is to think beyond those failures and limitations, So one of the failures that we want to address with this book is that of a stunning lack of imagination on so much of the so-called left. So much of the so-called left is frighteningly unimaginative and seems to have accepted a position of acquiescence, and especially on the question of capitalism. So on the left, it is common to be a lot of things, but not to be an abolitionist when it comes to the question of capital or capitalism. And that position is perhaps best exemplified in a book that was published in 2014 by an economist from the Paris School of Economics named Thomas Piketty. He wrote a book called Capital in the 21st Century. And that book was a remarkable book in many ways. It was published in 2014 on Harvard University Press. It was written by an economist. And it was not even really a book. It was an event. It was even right here in Springfield in the Barnes & Noble, they had their own end table display of Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st century. And so that book was an event. It was a remarkable event. I couldn't believe, and neither could so many others around the world, that so many people were interested in reading a 500-page tome written by an academic economist. In that book, Capital in the 21st Century, which was warmly embraced by liberals and leftists around the world, Piketty shows that capitalism, in fact, he proves that capitalism in that book has generated, does generate, and will continue to generate unacceptable inequality. So the whole book is a 15 years long research going back hundreds of years globally in human history that documents beyond any shadow of a doubt, and it has been criticized, but not for its basic insights and conclusions. It's been criticized for various things about methodology and overlooking this thing or that thing. But the end of it is that it seems to make the conclusive case to showing that capitalism is just going to continue to generate more and more inequality. And it has got to do that. And he even has a formula that he goes into great detail to show the absolute necessity of capitalism to generate inequality, growing, and irreversible. So, when I was reading that book, I was struck. I said somewhere on page 350 something, well, surely then, the end of this book is going to be some type of a critique of capitalism, because according to him, Piketty, who hates inequality, capitalism is never going to do anything but generate more of it. Well, it turns out that at the end of the book, he accepts capitalism, and not only does he accept capitalism, but in the title of the book, Capital in the 21st Century, he had already decided in 2014 that we would just have a whole nother century governed by the logic of money, governed by capital, and that people's lives, the world, the environment, would be ruled by money, governed by capital. And so the title of our book is Against Capital in the 21st Century, because we just think that he didn't write the right last chapter. There are also other problems. They start on page 2 and 3. But fundamentally, we have to reject, I think, his conclusion. At the end of his book, there are no alternatives beyond a tax initiative that is aimed to re-regulate a near totally liberated capital. He calls it this refurbished brand of a. He says it's not like a Tobin tax or a tax you've seen before. He calls it a global tax on capital. Now, I'm talking a little bit about Piketty, but I want to be clear. This book is really not about Piketty. In fact, nobody in the book is dealing with Piketty except for myself and my co-editor. In the introductory essay, we do talk a lot about Piketty. But the contents of the book it's other people than us, and they're not writing about Piketty. They're not criticizing Piketty. To take up this book, there's no requirement that one has to read Piketty. The thing is, we didn't want to ask all these brilliant theorists, philosophers, and critics to limit their thinking to a critique of a book that is ultimately unimaginative and devastatingly limited. And so we asked them to write other things. And inside this book, we have a lot of different theorists. We have poets. We have fiction writers. We have Charles Bukowski in this book. We have Martina Spada in this book, a wonderful Latino poet. We have really excellent authors who are writing about really important things, all of which get to the heart of the problems of the existing society, which is something that never does happen in Piketty's iconic book. The other thing is that John, the co-editor, my co-editor and I, we share a commitment to thinking against a sectarianism that has long divided radical milieus of Marxism, anarchism, critical social theory, feminism, and other currents. So in some ways, this book is it's a little work of blasphemy. It's a non-sectarian collection that brings together texts and authors that are typically not put together, and that very ideological people in radical milieus on the left would likely be offended by the pairing and the cohabitation of some of these authors. But we think that we have to go where there's good stuff, and we got to go get it. We got to take good ideas where they are, and we have to use them. So we wanted this volume to embody and reflect some of the real diversity of thought that's out there, and to gather it beyond and even against rigid ideological reactions. So we used three basic criteria in compiling this volume. The first is that we wanted a range of theorists, activists, and artists who offered a deep, if not a total, critique of capitalism. So this is a book that is, as the title doesn't hide, an anti-capitalist book. Right? It is a radical critique of capitalism. Second, we sought contributions that were not interested in any resuscitation of the top-down politics of leftist statism, which we feel should be left buried in the graveyards of the 20th century. If we have learned anything from the 20th century, it ought to be that radical movements and projects that try to deal with the problems of capital really cannot do it in a top-down statist way. And that we have seen that people with good intentions, once they lay their hands on the power of the state, they end up doing things, if not immediately, invariably, that require us to oppose them. And of course, they have always been opposed, and often very soon by the people who helped them get there. All right? And so there's a lot of this that we can talk about if you want to. So it's an anti-statist, anti-capitalist book, by and large. Third, we wanted to include some of the real diversity mentioned above. So in addition to contributors from many academic disciplines, we also took care to include contributions from black, radical, and feminist writers. So this is not a book full of men, okay? It's not a book of white male philosophers. Contributions in the book include Frantz Fanon, Raya Dunayevskaya, Sylvia Federici, Selma James, CLR James, Alicia Garza. We even have Sound of the Police by KRS-One as an entry in the section on art. Isabel Stangers, Marina Citrin, Angela Metropolis. This is a part of the diversity of the book. I think it's a good book. I wasn't always sure it was going to be. In fact, I have to tell you, I didn't love making this book. John is a wonderful, wonderful co-editor. I think he made it as good of an experience as it could be. But it's pretty awful. I'm not really here to talk about the awful aspects of co-editing a book, but if you really are interested, I'm happy to share that. But I do think it's a good book, and it came together nicely in the end, despite the fact that it was not necessarily as fun as listening to a punk rock band. That's much more fun thing to do. So all I really wanted to do this evening is a kind of short reading from the book. It'll be very short. Just a couple of things I wanted to read aloud and have some open conversation, if we could do that. And so I've just got some passages from the introductory essay that I'll read and talk about a little bit myself, and then we can talk to each other in a kind of open forum. So that's really the idea. So I won't be going on for much longer then. So, against capital in the 21st century. Now, in the beginning of Piketty's book, he tells the reader that he's going to use the words capital and wealth interchangeably. He says, I'm going to do this to simplify the text. You've all heard those words, I'm sure. Maybe you have used them synonymously. Capital and wealth. Capital and wealth are two words. Surely all of you have used the word wealth. I don't know how many people talk about capital. I'm not talking about the state capital of Illinois. But you've all heard the words. They're familiar words, wealth and capital. And the question is, are they synonymous? Well, Piketty says in the beginning of his book that he's going to simplify the text by treating them as perfectly synonymous. So we say, wealth is not capital. Capital is not something in the world that we can measure, although its effects can be measured. Capital is a logic that organizes the world: work, education, home life, social life, entertainment, news media, our free time, and indeed most of our wakeful state. So capital is not merely a logic in some philosophical sense, for it concretely organizes real life from birth to death. It is an ideology materialized. Wealth, I'm going to make this clear. All right, so a lot of people in this room are students of mine, so you know I say that a lot. I'll make it clear. It's a little bit unclear when you just read it out loud, and then we'll make it clear here in a minute. So wealth can be defined at and above a certain income level, but it is one of thousands of outcomes. Wealth is one of thousands of outcomes of the capitalist organization of life. However, and this is why Piketty is one of the reasons why Piketty is wrong, and by the way, much of the rest of the world, is that poverty is yet another outcome of capital. Poverty is an outcome of capital. Wealth is not synonymous with capital, and wealth is not the main outcome of capitalism. I mean, let me say that again. Wealth does not mean capital, and wealth is not the primary outcome of capitalism. If you really want to look at the macroeconomic reality of the world, including the one that was published by Piketty himself, the actual fact is that poverty is the more widespread outcome of capital. And it would have made no less sense to equate capital and capitalism with poverty. And we should think about that when we hear people talking about capitalism. How come when people say the word capitalism, we don't think about a world full of impoverished people? How come when people say the word capitalism, we don't think about Megawati in Indonesia or Honduras, where capital runs free and more unregulated than in any other places you can find on earth? We should, when we hear the word capital and capitalism, not think of wealth. We should have a different association, in fact, the opposite association. Since most people living in the capitalist world, it turns out, are poor. And by the way, that's not an argument or a theoretical statement. It's just a non-controversial fact that nobody would disagree with. Most of the people living in the capitalist world are poor. So capital is no more wealth than it is poverty. And this basic point is not only lost on Piketty, but it's lost on many people who participate in conversations about economics, not just academics, but in your home, in your workplace, around elections. When people talk about economics, when they think about capital, they think about wealth, and they ought not to do that. As Marx defined it in 1844, and now I'm quoting Marx, capital is thus the governing power over labor and its products. The capitalist process possesses this power not on account of his personal or human qualities, but inasmuch as he is an owner of capital. His power is the purchasing power of his capital, which nothing can withstand. Later we shall see first how the capitalist, by means of capital, exercises his governing power over labor. Then, however, we shall see the governing power of capital over the capitalist himself, close quotes. Now think about that. It's not immediately, again, obvious, but capital, if it is not wealth, but rather a power, it even has power over the individual capitalist. That was Marx's insight in 1844. He understood that capital was not wealth, and he also understood that capital was a power that ruled over the capitalist. So, while one could be said to own capital, capital is a power that governs, including those who own it. It even governs those who own it. You know, Jacques Camus, great French theorist, talked about the willing slaves of capital, but we're not just people. I mean, hedge fund managers are the willing slaves of capital too. Right? Multinational corporations. So governments are governed by capital. Well, if you really think about that, I think you'll all know what I mean. Right? Governments are governed by money. Right? They are governed by capital. Governments do not simply govern the economy. They are governed by capital. Work is governed by capital. But so is non-work, inasmuch as the times and spaces when we are not working are also largely determined by the logic of capital. So if you have a punk band and you want to have band practice, when can you have it? Only when all four members are not working. That's your common leisure time, right? So your leisure time is also determined by capital. Critical to Marx's definition is that the governing power of capital governs the capitalist himself. Now here we can and must also distinguish capital from wealth in the following way. Whereas wealth is an instrument of the capitalist, we say, is an instrument of capital. The capitalist does what he does, thinks what he thinks, aspires what he aspires to do and to be, and accepts a moral point of view, a comprehensive worldview, all made by capital. The aspirations of capitalists don't come from nowhere. The aspirations of capitalists don't come from nowhere. I mean, was it true in the 17th century that, early prefigurative English capitalists who were reading John Locke woke up in the morning and dreamt of a Lexus? No. The aspirations and the very specific desires themselves don't come from nowhere. Capitalist society educates and acculturates generations of true believers to accept the virtues of a highly individualist, familial vocational privatism. All right, that term, familial vocational privatism, is from another philosopher, Habermas, that we cite here. But the idea is that privatization is not just the process of making healthcare private, Social Security private, education private, everything private. Privatization also involves turning us inward and away from each other and our common concerns, and looking only at ourselves and our family and career in a very privatized way. A world without capitalists is no capitalist world. But understanding this is critical to the rejection of Piketty's and much of the rest of the world's conflation of wealth with capital. Now let's take a look. This is one thing we mention here in the book. In recent U.S. politics, as an example. Consider you live in a country where there are millions of Trump supporters that come from the impoverished white working class who energetically defend capitalist society while possessing no wealth of their own. From bottom to top, those who defend and perpetuate capitalist ideology are instruments of capital. What that means is that instruments of capital, the capitalists are instruments of capital, and also the people who support capital, who don't have any wealth, can be, do you understand what I mean by that? Is that they can be capitalists without wealth. Think about those who vigorously and passionately defend Trump and Trumpism. They don't necessarily need wealth to be very vocal in support of giving the government over to a businessman in the hopes that he'll run it like a casino. And even he would come to this podium and so brazenly and openly say, I am qualified to run the government because I run hotels and casinos. So think about that. These people do not have wealth. Some of them do. That is absolutely true. But what I say, what I'm referring to here is I'm referring to across this country, white working class people who passionately defend Trump and Trumpism. They don't have wealth, but they want wealth to govern. And that is one of the other ways in which you can be a capitalist without wealth. Okay? So we have to understand that capitalism is not connected to wealth. And if it's causally related to anything, it has got to be to poverty and inequality, which it is generating globally in ways that I have to tell you. When Marx wrote about capitalism in 1840s and 50s and 60s, he could never have imagined the level of inequality that is now widely documented in the most conservative sources. Now, to demonstrate another poverty of thinking, another sort of place in which we have to, we think, and we hope this book will help to do, change the fundamental thinking. What we do in the introduction is we look at the single most dumbfounding and backward claim of Piketty's book, which is not the treating of capital and wealth as synonymous. That's just a catastrophic mistake, but it's not the single most catastrophic. Okay? So the single most catastrophic is when Piketty claims that taxation is, and now I'm quoting him, preeminently a political and philosophical issue, perhaps the most important of all political issues. Again, this is Piketty. Without taxes, society has no common destiny and collective action is impossible. Close quote. Now, I just want you to know that this is an astounding statement from a historical or a political point of view to say, and I'm going to read it again, without taxes, society has no common destiny and collective action is impossible. But I don't want to beat up on one economist who's widely read. I want you to keep in mind how many of your liberal and leftist friends believe that the path to dealing with problems like inequality and exploitation is through some form of taxation. Piketty only brings that to its most brutal conclusion when he says that nothing else matters but taxation. But the poverty of that claim is exasperating. Thomas Hobbes Thomas Hobbes had a far richer understanding of the Commonwealth in 1651 than Piketty in 2014. Whereas David Graeber, an anarchist anthropologist who has a chapter in this book, Graeber demonstrates that taxes were established as a way for kings to finance wars. Still true today, folks. And Graeber does a history in his book on debt, and we have some of that in this volume, but that he does a history of taxation in which he shows that it comes from the interest of kings to finance wars. It hasn't gone away. For Piketty, taxation is the apex of human association. It's the way that we show our solidarity and our commonality. And human solidarity. After nearly 2 centuries of tax resistance as a political and philosophical issue, by no means beginning or ending with Henry David Thoreau's famous example, because sometimes people have been tax resistors. You may have heard about that. Activists who refuse to pay taxes. That's called tax resistance. Piketty claims that you can't do anything without taxation. The collective action is impossible without taxes. Now, this claim might come as a surprise to social movements, going back to the abolitionists and to the suffragists. It may come as a surprise to recent participants in global uprisings over the past decade, to a long history of slave revolts. And there is a long history of slave revolts. And while I do think you can contextualize Kanye's, you can give some context to Kanye to help him out, the fact is there's a long history of slave revolts. Insurrection, armed rebellion, strikes, sit-ins, town and factory takeovers, and organized movements of boycott and divestment, to not only revolutions, which have happened, but revolutionaries and their insurgent cultures. And by the way, one of the other reasons I like to launch books in punk spaces is because punk in the United States and North America has a history of being a part of insurgent culture. It has a history of being a part of insurgent culture. And where I lived in New York City, the space on the Lower East Side, ABC No Rio, it wasn't just a place to go hear music. It was a place to make signs and make plans, to occupy, to interfere with the plans of developers. And so insurgent culture is a part of history too. On the non-political front, the fact that a common destiny or some sense of a common cause for a shared future hope is impossible without taxes would come as a surprise to families around the world. The family is a point of contact that we have with community and human solidarity that is not taxation. Can be if there are good elements to it. Religious communities, humanists of any kind, from Immanuel Kant to Jean-Paul Sartre, to LGBT movements, impoverished black movements in the United States, indigenous peoples, the Zapatistas of Mexico, and so many other distinct communities of choice and faith. From the broad ideals of hospitality and inclusion to the coordinated human actions of striking workers, occupation movements, and jail solidarity, the claim that society can only have a common destiny through taxes announces nothing short of a brazen historical stupidity. And so what we are saying is that we need to use our imaginations, and we need to think beyond the boundaries of the failures of a long history of statist leftism. We need to think beyond the failures of efforts going back hundreds of years to reverse the bus through things like taxation. The bus has not been reversed, and there are many good people who have tried to slow it. But the acceleration and growth of inequality hasn't been stayed. And in this book, too, we want to move beyond thinking about capitalism in terms of poverty and inequality. So, for example, we have sections of this book on ecology. We have sections on racialization and feminist theory, collective action and culture, and we have art in this book. And what happens when art is governed by the logic of capital is you get Transformers 27. And people who really have something to say in their art, well, they can perform on the stage at Black Sheep, which is good. It's good. Because we need subversive creativities, and we need the gatherings of marginalities, more now than ever. But when you have art governed by money, you have bad art. But when you have a culture governed by the logic of capital, you have people who eat it up. They develop over time an appetite for the most vapid forms of content. And they will even stage really noble defenses of crap and say, who are you to say it's bad? You're an elitist, you know. You're an elitist if you don't like, whatever, Justin Bieber, whoever the latest. I don't know a lot of the hippest one, but, you must be an elitist. Who are you? How dare you to say it? But you have to understand how a long history of culture governed by money has effects on cultural products that acculturate the tastes within society. So this is something, for example, that's been written about since the 1940s and 50s by C. Wright Mills, who talked about, cultural workmen, the people who produce cultural products. You can make some art that has something to say, but who will hear it? Who will see it? It's hard to find. Capital makes everything visible except for the best stuff. So what we want to do is to think beyond the limits of the left. We want to think against the tendencies of liberal and left capitulations to yet another century governed by money. We can't have that. And so we do have a chapter on ideology. We have a piece written by Freddie Perlman called American Common Sense, about how common sense becomes what it is through processes of education, or rather miseducation. We have a chapter on education. And education is something I'm very, very much a part of. I work in higher education. And the demand is always the same demand. The demand is, how is what you do going to help graduates make money? And when you go to meetings at universities across this country and many other countries now as well, and you say, the purpose of an education is not to feed people into the existing opportunity structure of the society, to make them capable of criticizing it, to make them capable of things like democracy. And by that, I don't mean elections. To make them capable of things like detecting ideological distortion when they see it. And people say, well, Trump calls everything fake news. Well, one of the few things he's right about is fake news. The problem is it's everywhere, and it's been going on since the mass media began, since public relations got a hold, since people like Ivy Lee and Edward Bernays and Capital got a hold of trade papers and political papers, and they figured out how to use them to sell things. And don't think the commercials stop when the program returns. That's usually when the real selling begins. So it's a diverse book. I can't say I agree with every single thing in it either. And the authors themselves don't agree with each other. This is not a cohesive view. It may sound right now that I'm presenting one, but in fact the book doesn't. And I don't really have a single cohesive view to share with you. But if you are looking for the view that that embraces, accepts, and defends the existing capitalist world, then you should stay away from this book. And what I would say is, you don't need this book because that view is everywhere around you. And sometimes if somebody would say to me, occasionally a student in a particular class or about a book, where is the other side? To which I always say, the other side is everywhere. You don't need me to write a book containing it. You don't need me to teach a class containing the other side. You walk out the class, and the other side is all there is. So I really would just make a general recommendation that when people do read books, when they do take classes, if the side they're getting is the one that's everywhere outside the covers of the book, outside the classroom, then you should demand a refund and look somewhere else. So I think I'll just leave it there. Thanks for your time and thanks for your attention. It's much appreciated. Thank you. Now, maybe there's something I said that you don't like. Maybe there's, yes. I don't know the exact percentage number on that, but it's the vast majority. And if you look at the sources to look at, the conservative ones would be the OECD. The OECD is a neoliberal organization that publishes yearly data on global inequality and poverty, and it's worse every year. The United Nations publishes also free online. You can just look these up if you want. The UNDPs are called United Nations Development Program reports, and they have a lot of data that says almost all of the world is poor. I don't know the exact percentage. Oxfam last year, before some of the scandals that have plagued them in the past 6 months, but nonetheless, the scandals didn't touch the data. Oxfam reported that 8 people own most of the world's wealth. So what we're talking about in any case, and of course one of the issues is how different research organizations define poverty, right? So there are categories like absolute poverty, and there are other measures that move beyond poverty, like the Gini index and coefficient measures that look at other things like human capabilities and life longevity. So there isn't really a single unanimous answer to the question, but what is non-controversial to say is that the most conservative sources agree that most of the world is poor. And the thing, if you really want to know about something like democracy and capitalism, is you can have capitalism without democracy. Because if you look at how many people in this world are poor, and you think about democracy in the sense of demos, which means people, and krasi, which means power, the power of the people. Demos krasi literally means the people's power. You ask yourself, would most of the world's people, if asked, say, we demand to be poor? So quite obviously, what governs the world is not the democratic interest of its peoples. Because if that were the case, it just wouldn't be true that most of the people living on this earth are poor, right? So you can take a look at Oxfam and for national the national macroeconomic stuff, the best source I've found is the Economic Policy Institute, EPI.org. They used to publish the State of the Nation every year. It's an unbelievably stunning and harrowing picture when you see that, for example, upward mobility doesn't exist in the United States. It's one of the most central tenets of capitalist mythology. The capitalist mythology has always said that people who work hard can move up and make more. But the truth is that people that work the hardest are making the least. And that's quantitatively and qualitatively, the most hours, the most exhaustive forms of labor. So people who are working 60 or 70-hour work weeks and are exhausted physically and emotionally at the end of the day are not making the most money. They are not. So the EPI shows actually that rather than upward mobility, there has been, since the 70s, a frightening trend of downward mobility. And sometimes I hesitate to tell my students, many of whom are in this room, that the EPI's data is pretty conclusive, that the present generation cannot reasonably expect to live at the income level of its parent generation. Right? So not only is there no upward mobility, but there is a new phenomenon, relatively new, diagnosed in the research called downward mobility. And it's frightening because as you have downward mobility, the cost of everything goes up. Even public universities. I teach at a public university. And there are students not even a mile away at Lincoln Land who have said to me, I want to come to UIS, but I can't afford it. It's astounding to think that there were public universities in this country in the 50s and 60s that were free, land-grant universities that understood that public higher education was a common good, and it was not to be governed by money. It was not to be governed by capital. Well, it is governed by money, and even the public universities are. They're only public in name. It's now a misnomer. Everything's governed by money. So if I want to teach a course, it has to justify itself using the market logic. It might be a good course that people could really use, but people are counting seats and tuition revenues, and they report back on that. This phenomenon governs higher education in the United States and increasingly around the world. So this is just a part of the picture, but it's showing once again that it's not the interests of the 7.5 billion that are governing. It's something else, and that's what we try to get at. Right. Well, I think this is a very good point. I mean, I would say, in fairness to many liberals and leftists around this country and world, that they are not, in fact, advocating funding war. Some of them are, very openly, and that is true. But many of them, and Piketty, I think, is included among this, he is not advocating funding wars. He is imagining that the political will can be mustered in the face of ecological crisis and inequality to get the states of the world to impose a tax not to fund wars, but rather to deal with the problems of inequality and ecological crisis. Now, what I have to say about this is very close to my heart. Is that, often people say, but you have to be practical. You have to be practical, and at least something like the global tax is an idea that we can imagine. What are you talking about? Because nobody has said it yet, but soon enough, if we keep talking, somebody will say, what do you want? What do you want? And the reality of it is that people say, well, at least the taxation he's imagining something that can be done. There are taxes, and maybe we could do them in a different way. But the problem is that the governments that would impose them are governed by capital. The governments there's a documentary record of governments handing over their regulatory powers to consortiums of bankers and investors, to which they then become beholden, like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And if you look at a country like Greece or Spain, you can see that the government is governed by debt. It doesn't govern, it's governed by money. So then I say, when people say, well, what about something like revolution? Well, now, hold on now. Anarchists and Marxists, and there's a long history of people who talk about revolution. And they always are confronted with the claim, but that's impractical. Taxation is something we know how to do and we can do. The problem is that I think the concept of taxing inequality out of existence is the single most utopian idea on earth. You have got to be more utopian than the most surrealist anarchist on earth to believe that you can get governments governed by capital to sign on to a global tax policy that will reverse the bus on growing global inequality. That is supposed to be the practical alternative to things like revolution. That's insane. Well, I mean, just look, when people on the left, folks, over the past several years, when people on the left have said we've got to deal with poverty in the world, when people on the left have said we've got to deal with poverty in the world, they've said we've got a noble and dangerous idea. We call it the fight for 15. We got to get $15 an hour for people in the service sector. If they were making $15 an hour to 40-hour work week with a little bit of taxes, that wonderful thing that will solve inequality, they'll be making $27,000 a year. $27,000 a year is a living wage for a family of three in 1972. But not in a city. It's a living wage for a family of two maybe in 1940, okay, in Chicago. So what did the people who demanded $15 an hour get called? Well, they got called radicals. They're absolutely extremist. Who demands a $15 an hour wage? What a total revolutionary. You know, Hillary Clinton would go on the stage and she would say of Bernie Sanders, well, it's a wonderful idea, but it's too utopian. And you mean to tell me that a living wage in 1940 is called utopian? But you know what is utopian? It is utopian to imagine service sector workers all around this country getting paid $15 an hour. That's not happening. But you know what is happening? Black revolt in this country is happening. Strikes are happening right now as we sit in Arizona and other states that many people in the coastal parts of the country like to look at and say, if only they were as liberal as us. Well, people in Boston should look at Virginia. And they should look in Arizona and see that these teachers are not going back to class. Well, that happens. You're much more likely to get a strike. Now, what's Arizona going to give? It's going to be a pittance. It's going to be a pittance. And they know it's a pittance. And so we need to keep on going. And we need to keep on thinking and imagining and being more and more creative. And we can't give up. We can give up. Let me change that. We can give up. And acquiescence only accelerates the existing reality in the direction it's been going. And so I do believe in being political. I do. And some political philosophers and some philosophers I teach do not. I do. It can be a Sisyphean idea. You know, that myth of Sisyphus, of pushing that rock up that hill and it's never going to get to the top. But we cannot accept what is unacceptable. That's a moral principle, I would argue. We cannot tolerate the intolerable. And so we've got to figure out what to do with that. And it can be put in lots of different places. The last chapter of this book is called New Modalities of Collective Action. And it's people imagining different things that can be done with that energy. You know, the energy that we would put into thinking beyond the limits of the existing reality, challenging it, and using our imaginations to come up with something better. So we have Stout and Lind, piece called From Globalization to Resistance, where he talks about the Zapatistas, and he talks about indigenous movements that are in some ways showing the way forward. We have a piece by Guy Debord who talks about, art and creative movements and how to... Guy Debord was not only a theorist, he was also a filmmaker, and how to sort of show people different ways of looking at themselves in the world. So he has a piece in here called New Forms of Action in Politics and Art. So we have Marina Citron in here who's got the concluding piece, and she writes about Nuit Debout, the French movement from 2 years back, where the French government wanted to impose Loi Travail, which was a labor law that would enable French corporations to fire their employees for no reason. They said, well, we don't need a reason. Let's create a law that says there doesn't have to be a reason. Right, and we have that in the United States. Right. That's right. Yeah. So it's already a reality, but it just keeps on going, and it's going not in the right direction. It's going in the wrong direction. So who's the utopian? The person who stands up in Ferguson or Baltimore. The cover of this book. One of my friends asked me, why in a book called Against Capital in the 21st Century do you have 2 police officers? Well, the answer is that these are police officers standing in the Mall of America in Minnesota during the Black Lives Matter shopping mall disruption. I love shopping mall disruptions. And then, just so you know, we do have one in Springfield. But I like the idea of shopping mall disruptions. I love it. And they're really big in Latin America, shopping mall protests. But we had in 2016 Black Lives Matter protests in the Mall of America in Minnesota. And these cops that you see on the front of this book are protecting the shopping mall from what? We had a different picture we wanted to use. It was great. We couldn't use it. You can't imagine how proprietary some of these photos are. But it had the sign, said Mall of America. But on the outside, on the sidewalk, there was a row of riot cops. So we have to see, the problem is that the whole system is set up to defend capital. That's the reason for the image on the cover of the book. The whole system is set up to defend those who would sell you things, none of which anybody needs. Yeah. It's incredible how little it takes to bring things to a grinding halt. That's a part of the psychosocial problem we live under. We live in a society in which people do not feel their or know their power. In fact, we believe we don't have any at all. But if on Monday morning enough people in any city on this earth decided not to go to work, things would stop. Okay. The problem is it's much easier said than done. We have a situation of normalized obedience, where the expectation of total obedience is hardly even necessary. So, look, hope is in some ways always measured by that particular despair. That that it's very hard to get things happening and get things going. But we have some breaking points that we're going to live through in the 21st century or not. One of them is the ecological crisis. The ecological crisis is not theoretical from the perspective of geology. It's very real. And the ecological crisis it it seems to me the height of irresponsibility to say in the very beginning of the 21st century, let's have another century governed by the same logic that gave us the last two. And so when people say, well, being against capital in the 21st century is a hard thing to be, my response is, it's irresponsible to be anything but. Yeah, it's a really good question. The question is about, alternatives to capital or alternatives to capitalism. And what I think is so remarkable is that we all have a very rich experience with forms of human relationality, being in the world, doing things with others that are decisively non-capitalist. They're not governed by money. So what we've got to do is we've got to look at the things we love most. The things we love most, I think, for most of the people we know, have to do with human relationships, forms of human solidarity, a family, a partner, a friend, friendship. One, on the most basic level, and this is very general, I know, but on the most basic level, we actually do a lot of things that are not governed by money. Black Sheep does a lot of things that are not governed by money. I still do a lot of things in the classroom that are not governed by money. In fact, I find ways to only do things in the classroom that are not governed by money, although it's not always easy, by the way. And when I am with my young children, I don't use the logic of capital to determine what I do with them. We play, and we are very imaginative, and we go into our own worlds and we imagine all kinds of things. And these are forms of human relationality that mean more than the relationships you have with your colleagues at work. And what I would say the starting point to answer your question is to say something like this: the best things under capitalism are the least capitalist things. So when we, it's kind of a version of what I was saying before about, there's a more concrete, specific answer I could give, but just at the general level, I mean, what I was saying before that it's a mistake to always use capital and wealth as a synonym. The other mistake we often make is everything we love in this society, we credit to capitalist society. But we ought not to do that. There are a lot of things we love in this society that are refuge from, are themselves, they function as a refuge from work and capital. The home, for example, if it's not a space of abuse, unfortunately it is for many people. Home life can be a space of abuse. But the home can be a refuge from capital. It can be the community, the neighborhood, the punk venue, where people who feel marginalized and maligned at school can come to feel a sense of human solidarity and connectivity with others like them. Those things are forms of relationality that are real, and no one would ever dare tell someone who benefits from them that they're not meaningful enough. In fact, they're so meaningful that they oftentimes are matters of survival in this precarious world that we live in. More specifically and concretely, I do quite like the idea of Silvia Federici of the Commons, which maybe is on my mind because I was teaching it last night, and there are some students in this room who, I don't know how you can come back for more after last night's 3.5-hour session, but I am touched and moved. But not only did we talk about Silvia Federici's theory last night in class, but she talks about it in this book. And so she writes about this thing called the Commons, Michael, which is, establishing, and it actually is an idea that could be traced back to Thomas Hobbes, who wrote about the Commonwealth, rather than a privatized wealth, the Commonwealth. So take something like nature, the natural environment and ecology. Somebody as far from my own thinking as John Locke wrote about the common, the natural world as a common property of everyone. But he said
John Locke said in the Treatises of Government that if we just left the natural world as a common property, all humans would die because they would want to eat grapes and apples, but they wouldn't allow themselves to take them because they belong to everybody in common. So he said that's why we need to convert all the common property of the world into private property. See, I disagree. I think we need to defend the commons, and we can defend spheres of the natural world as a common good, as a common property. And in 2014, the Turkish government was almost overthrown when Prime Minister Erdogan wanted to build a shopping mall on a public park. So, and what the people said of Turkey, they said this is a common space, a gathering space. It's a common good. It's a commons and has to be defended. Now, that's not the only way of doing it, but it's one way of doing it. We could try to define what are commons, like water. Can you believe we live in a society where water is not available to Americans? People in Flint, Michigan don't have water, and the solution is to get clean water, you have to buy it from a private company. Airwaves. I mean, take something like the radio, you know? I mean, airwaves, there's a huge struggle to keep airways as a part of the common property. We can fight those things, and people have done with public radio, and they've tried to say that there has to be a defense of airwaves as the common, and water as the common. In Bolivia, in Cochabamba, when Bechtel came in and said, we want to take your water, purify it, and then sell it back to you at a price that the people who live in Cochabamba can't afford to pay, so therefore you won't have it. It will be clean, but you won't be able to, drink it. The people said, well, that's not acceptable. So they rose up and they said, no, water is not private property. It's a common property. And they actually won. Okay? So I do believe that it is possible to establish some collective sense of what is a common. And I would include in that education and childcare. Right? And then we would have to confront the fact that most of the care workers on earth are women, and they do that work for free. That's another problem with capital, is it has no way of valuing the things we value most. So we have to come to see that most of the most vulnerable people who do the most important work in this world, namely women, are expected to do that work unpaid. And I actually think that and that's another thing that Silvia Federici talks about, so I'm kind of riffing on her idea, but there are many other things that can be done. And the thing is that I suppose as a half measure, as a way of dealing with some problem here or there, taxation might be a part. But the problem is that is terribly unimaginative, and there's so much more we can think of and do, and we have to, actually. We don't actually have a choice. And the question is, like, why would you take a radical position? Why not take you don't have a choice but to take another position as far as I see it. Because the problems we face are very extreme ones, and they're severe and getting worse. Yeah, I really don't know the answer to that question. I will say the first author who starts this book is John Holloway. He's a really great anti-state Marxist. He's a Marxist who is fiercely critical of the possibility of radical transformation passing through government. So he wrote a book called Change the World Without Taking Power. And he wrote a book called Crack Capitalism, and we got this excellent piece from him that starts this book. It's awesome. It's what he talks about is cracks, like in a pane of glass, how they grow and they spread. It's very poetic, actually. He works and lives in Mexico, and he's inspired by the poetry of the Zapatistas, who would read poems from the balcony during the revolution, the uprising. And John Holloway, he talks about cracks, and he says, like, when people, where you have, like, like you were saying, shrinking space and shrinking of the natural world. When they take over buildings and they squat in buildings, when they take over unused green space and they grow food on it, that even with a very little bit of space, you can say, I'm going to convert this private into a common. Right? And so sometimes what happens, it's even quite interesting to track it in the United States, because there's a movement of this where city officials will come and they'll say, well, you're growing fruits and vegetables on this plot of land, but that plot of land doesn't belong to you. To which people will say, yeah, I know it doesn't belong to us, but nobody, the owner of it lives in another state on the other side of the country, and they have a sign. By the way, look around Springfield. Springfield, Illinois, if you drive around, you will find green lots of land with little signs in them saying lot for sale. That's private property, but it's unused. Well, in cities that are much more densely populated than this one, sometimes it happens that people start growing vegetables on it. And right, and so that kind of thing happens, and then city officials are confronted with having to shut it down, which sometimes doesn't look very good, because if it reverts to its previous position, it's just an unused lot of land, whereas right now it's feeding people in the neighborhood. So there's no easy answer. People who want easy answers, I'm not saying that's you, I think have to, and I know that's not what you were saying, but it's very hard to do what you're saying. The question, it's absolutely difficult. It might be impossible. It's a great question. And, again, one of the other authors we have in this book is Murray Bookchin. He's an anarchist ecologist. He's got a chapter in this book. And one of the things he says is, if we don't do the impossible, we'll be faced with the unthinkable. And I think he was right when he said, if we don't do the impossible, we'll be faced with the unthinkable. So it's really, really hard. It's really, really difficult. But people are trying. And we need to see what we can do that we're good at. I don't want everybody to just become gardeners. If I became a gardener, I would be very unhappy. So what I do, and not only that, but you wouldn't think somebody could die planting a garden, but I'm pretty sure that I would just somehow die. I mean, I don't know. I would probably impale myself with what are they called? Trowels? Thanks. Yeah, I would impale myself accidentally with a trowel. It's really bad. So what I do is I write things because I think I'm pretty good at it. Some people review the books I write and they say they disagree. Some people do agree and some people don't agree. But I think I'm pretty good at teaching and writing, and that's what I do. Now, I'm not saying that everybody should grow gardens. Maybe you start a punk band. And I would like, and I know this goes back to the ancient history of the 1990s, but I think it would have been great to have a lyric sheet handed out with Priss, because I've read the lyrics of Priss, and they're good. They're really good. And it would be good if you could hear if you knew what that was being said in those songs. I think it's good stuff. So you can make music, you can make art, you can do lots of different things. Now the thing is, we're limited, each of us, by ourselves. It's a desperate position we're in. And everybody has different talents and proclivities. And if you do something, quote unquote, for the struggle, as is an old tradition on the radical left, you're going to burn out quickly, and you won't be a part of it for very long. And so I'm not an advocate of coming up with modalities of struggle or politics that seem to me like the most important things to do, but the people who would take them up would not enjoy themselves. I'm not an advocate of that. I believe that you've got to find out what you like to do and then put it in the service of, confronting what must be confronted, condemning what must be condemned, and changing what must be changed. So we do have different proclivities. And I think probably I will write radical theory until I die. Because I like doing it. But if I was organizing protests, I would have been done with that a long time ago. It's not something I'm good at. People do have talents for that, by the way. And I've known many of them. They're very good. People are organizers. Some people are not good public speakers, but they're very good at other things. But if you have something, a creative power within you, which I think everybody does do, the question is, how can you make a life of putting it in the service of transforming this rotten and upside-down world? I don't know. It is true that when I say find a joyful mode of resistance, that we do live in a world where people don't necessarily know what joy feels like. And that's why I think our crisis is not only political and economic, it's psychological and social. And I believe that down to the bone marrow. I believe that the crisis we live is not merely political and economic, it's psychological and social. And it is very serious. It's very serious. We live in a world where financial insecurity is connected to all kinds of anxiety and depression. And when people lose jobs, they also lose their sense of self-worth. And to say you're right, and that's a comment that cuts down deeper from where I was speaking, and I appreciate that. And I don't know the answer to the question, but we can't wash our hands of the problem. We just can't. So I need help, and and I have help with a lot of people, and maybe people will read a book like this and try to think of other ways of participating. But you had something to say. Well, on that one, I do have one or two ideas actually, and that is, and I don't want to go on for much longer, but I think that we are reaching a point with a number of problems in our social order, to where people are increasingly realizing, and I'll give you some specific examples in a moment, that their self-interest is not an isolated thing, so that if they really want to get the best for themselves or to get the best deal they can get, they're going to have to look out for a commons. And so the ecological crisis is one of the places, or one of the examples, where I do believe that. I don't even know that I would call it the activation of altruism. I don't know that I agree with that terminology. But I think it's something like a sense of the necessary interconnectivity of the self with others. One of the things that capitalism has been very effective at doing, and I think this is a part of your point, is cutting us off from other human beings, so that we need things like Twitter and Facebook, because we need prosthetic connections. The actual connectivity of the human world is broken. And things like Facebook and Twitter are prosthetic connections. They're phantom communities, like phantom limbs. And they make us feel like something is there when in fact it is not. So I don't even know that I would call it altruism. I think that we may reach a point where, like with the thing with what we have right now in this country with mass shootings, we're going to have to look at that beyond the limits of some kind of vilification of the criminal. We're going to have to look at what is going on in the social and cultural reality that young white boys live, that makes them want to carry out these acts of mass murder. It's a very dark place to go, but if we don't go there, we're going to be talking about the Second Amendment for another 100 years. And that is absolutely insane. Anyway, I feel a little bit of your exhaustion and a little bit of my own. So why don't we leave it there? Thanks, everybody. And thanks for your time and attention, and good night. Have a good night.